All right, I want you to take your Bibles. I want you to open with me to the very first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 32. Genesis chapter 32, starting in verse 22. I want to talk to you tonight about one of the most bizarre, one of the most crazy stories you're going to find in all of Scripture, but I think it's got a lot to say to us tonight, so we're going to look at it. Genesis 32, starting in verse 22. Again, it's another one of those stories. It's another narrative. We are talking about the power of story, the power of narrative, and we're going to find it again here in this story in Genesis chapter 32. Starting in verse 22, it says, "That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he sent them across the stream, he sent over all of his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, 'Let go of me, for it is daybreak.' But Jacob replied, 'I will not let go of you unless you bless me.' And the man asked him, 'What is your name?' 'Jacob,' he answered. Then the man said, 'Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome.' When the story begins, the sun's been down for quite some time. Stars are out, moon is shining, and everyone is resting comfortably. Everyone's sleeping peacefully in their own tent. Everyone except for Jacob. He's kicking the covers off. He's pulling the covers up. He's tossing. He's turning, fluffing his pillow. He's doing everything he can to bring any amount of peace or rest to his life, but nothing works. So finally, in the middle of the night, he gets up, leaves his tent, moves through his camp, and he wakes everyone and everything up. They come stumbling out of their tents, the eyes blurry, hair messed up, and they're looking at him like he's crazy. 'What are you doing, Jacob? It's the middle of the night, Jacob. What are we doing out here, Jacob?' And Jacob says, 'Pack it up.' 'What? You heard me. Pack it up. Strike the tents, pack it all up. You're leaving.' So in the middle of the night, Jacob wakes up, and he packs up everything that he has and everyone that he knows, and it says he sends them across the ford of the Jabbok. Why is that? What's going on in this man's life that would cause him to behave in this way? Well, the answer to that question lies in his past. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever done something that you regretted, something you wish with everything you have, that you could go back and undo? Words that you said that you wish you'd never spoken. Decisions you made you wish you'd never done. And you regret it so much, and the consequences of that decision or those words kept you up at night, caused you to lose sleep. That's what's happening here. You see, about 20 years before this moment in Genesis 32, Jacob was a much younger man, and Jacob, conspiring with his mother, stole what was called the blessing from his older brother Esau. Jacob grew up, and he all he wanted, what any boy wants, is the love and the approval of his father. And well, Jacob's father he showed a little bit of favoritism between he and his older brother Esau. And so because of that, one day Jacob gets up and, working with his mother, he steals the blessing by dressing up as his brother. He deceives his father and steals the blessing. Now Esau, the older brother, who was supposed to receive the blessing, Esau is angry, you can imagine, because the blessing was everything. The blessing was the authority, the inheritance that was only supposed to go to the older son. And so he's angry with Jacob, and he wants to kill him. He wants to take his revenge on his younger brother, and he wants to end his life. And so Jacob's mother, who was a part of all this, she comes to him and she says, "Jake, Esau, you see, he's not taking this as well as we would have liked." Really, I mean, I'm sure he's mad, but how mad is he? Well, he wants to kill you. And so you need to leave. So as a young man, she packs him up with basically just the cloak on his back, and she sends him away to visit some distant relatives. And she comforts him
as he is leaving his home, as he's leaving his family, he's leaving his mother, who's really the only one that ever showed him any kindness. He is leaving and he's going out on his own, and she tells him, listen, when your brother has calmed down and he's not angry anymore, I will send word for you and you can come home. When everything's calmed down, all the dust is settled and no one's mad anymore, I will send word for you and you can come home. That was 20 years ago. Fast forward, now we go 20 years later, and when we meet Jacob in Genesis chapter 32, he's on his way home. But here's the problem. Word was never sent. He never heard from his mother. So all he knows is that even after 20 years, he is walking back into a situation where his brother is still going to be so angry that he will kill him. Now, to make matters worse, he got a little bit of bad news. See, what Jacob did is he's knowing he's going to face his brother. And while he's been gone, in these last 20 years, Jacob's done pretty well. He's successful. He's coming home a rich man. He leaves with nothing, and he comes home with lots of things. And so he's prosperous, he's successful, he's wealthy. And so what he does is he puts together this little offering, a gift out of his wealth. And he gets some of his servants and he says, go on ahead of the camp. I want you to go find my brother Esau. I want you to tell him I'm coming home. And I want you to give him this gift. It's like a peace offering, trying to buy him off. And he says, I want you to come tell me what he says. I want to know what I'm getting myself into. I want to know what's waiting for me just beyond the horizon. And so he packs everything up. He sends the servants off. The servants come back. A few days later, the servants come back. And they approach Jacob, and Jacob says, did you find my brother Esau? Yeah, we found your brother Esau. Did you give him my gift? Yes, we gave him your gift. Did you tell him I'm coming home? Yeah, we found your brother Esau. We gave him your gift, and we told him, you're on your way. Well, what did he say? How did he respond? And they reported back to Jacob and said, your brother Esau is now coming to meet you with 400 men. Oh, he's still mad. Now, do you know why he can't sleep? Because every time he closes his eyes, all he can see is his brother with a small army of 400 men coming to wipe him and everyone he loves and everything he has off the face of the earth. So what does he do? He's got a small army bearing down on him, could attack at any time. What does he do? Well, now we kind of know what's going on, but we still don't understand what he's doing because he gets up and he sends everything away. Anything that could be a defense to him, anyone that could protect him, he sends it away. And he actually puts himself in a position of greater weakness. He makes himself more vulnerable by sending everyone away. Why would he do that? Well, again, I think the answer to why he's doing this lies in his past. Because listen, when he was running away from home the first time, when he was running away from his brother, as a young man 20 years before, he had nothing and no one, just the cloak on his back. And the Bible tells us he's there in the middle of nowhere. And really, the place, it has no name. It wasn't significant enough to even have a name. And it says he lays down and he puts his head on a rock for a pillow. Why do you put your head on a rock for a pillow? Because you've got nothing. Listen, if you're using a rock for a pillow, you have reached a really desperate and low time in your life. And so here Jacob is. He's nobody and he's absolutely nowhere. He has nothing to his name. And here's what happens. God shows up in this amazing vision. It says the doors of heaven open and the staircase descends. And he sees these angels ascending and descending the staircase. And God comes down and he shows himself to Jacob in this really powerful vision where he's standing over Jacob and he's standing next to Jacob. And he says, Jacob, I'm going to use you. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to prosper you. That's the promise that God gave to Jacob 20 years before, when he was running away from his brother. Now, fast forward to 20 years later, he sends everyone away, and I think what he's doing is he's trying to recreate the same situation just like it was 20 years before when he had no one and nothing. So he sends it all away because he knows, really in his heart, he knows the truth that even though he's been successful and even though he is prosperous and even though he's rich, all that he has and all that he has done, all of his success cannot save him from 400 men. All this stuff and all these people, they're ultimately useless to him, so he sends it away anyway, and he recreates that same situation, and I think he hits his knees in the middle of the desert, and he is looking up at heaven, and he goes, do you remember when you came and spoke to me? Do you remember when you showed up in my life 20 years before? Do you remember the promise you made to me? Do you remember you told me you would bless me? Well, I need you to come through on that right now. I need you to remember that promise right now because my brother is on his way. I think Jacob clears everything and everyone away, and he goes looking for God because he knows that God is the only one that can save him in this moment. God is the only one that can solve his problem. And so he hits the desert floor and he's looking up at the heavens and he's waiting. He's waiting for God to show up. He's waiting for God to make good on his promise. He's waiting for the doors of heaven to open again. He's waiting to see that staircase descend from heaven. He's waiting to see the angels coming and going. He's waiting to see God in all of his glory. But that's not what he sees. What does he get? Well, it says this. After he'd sent everyone across the stream, he sent over all of his possessions. So Jacob was left alone. And the word tells us, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Now, let's just get this out of the way right here at the beginning. This is not just a man. The Bible tells us later that this is more than the man. This is actually God showing up to answer his prayer, to meet with Jacob. This is God responding to Jacob's call. So this isn't just some stranger. Let's be clear, right? Jacob's not there in the middle of the desert, and some random stranger is walking through the desert in the middle of the night, and he's like, hey, you want to fight? And so they start to fight. No, this is God actually. Sorry, let me fix my mic here. This is God answering Jacob's prayer. God showing up. And he shows up, and what happens? They begin to wrestle. They begin to fight. Now, we look at that and we think, well, that doesn't really make much sense. I mean, Jacob, he has this expectation, I think, based on his history, based on how God has presented himself, based on how God met with him before. Jacob has an expectation of what God is going to do, of how God is going to appear. And then God shows up, and he doesn't do anything like Jacob expects. He doesn't show up in a way that Jacob is looking for. And why is that? Because here's the principle, guys. Listen to me. God doesn't always show up in the way you expect him to. He just doesn't. But here's what I know to be true. God always shows up in the way that you need him to. And what Jacob needs right now, God's wisdom knows. God, in his wisdom and in his knowledge, he looks at this guy, Jacob. He knows who this guy is. He knows what he has been and what he's become. And he knows right now what he needs. Sorry, guys, let me get this right. What he needs, he doesn't need another show, right? He doesn't need more glory and more angels and more power. And he doesn't need the divine heavenly pyrotechnic show. He's already had that. God looks at Jacob and he knows what he needs, and he needs a beating. He needs to be broken. And so God shows up and they start fighting. They start wrestling. Now here's what's interesting. That word wrestling in the original language, if you go back and do a study on that word, you know what that word means? Literally, the definition of the word wrestling in the original language, it means, get this is fascinating. It means to wrestle. Now, you're like, okay, so what is that? What are you saying? Here's my point. This is not some sort of symbolic moment. This is not some sort of metaphor. This is not Jacob curled up in a corner wrestling with his emotions and struggling with his situation. This is God meeting with Jacob, and they engage in hand-to-hand combat. This is God wrestling with one of his own, punching, gouging, struggling, fighting, twisting, turning, kicking, everything. They are fighting on the desert floor. The man shows up, and they begin to wrestle, and they wrestle till daybreak. They wrestle all night long. I mean, that is so bizarre. But then, hang on, it gets even weirder. Look at verse 25. When the man, now we know who the man is God. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Let me ask you a question, just on the surface. According to verse 25, who does it sound like is winning the fight? Sounds like Jacob's winning the fight. That's right. Let me ask you another deep theological question. If you happen to find yourself in a wrestling match with God in the middle of the desert floor, who's going to win? God. Yeah, not you. And I know some of you boys out there are like, boy, I've been working out. Okay, sit down, Tarzan, before you hurt yourself. You will not win a fight with God. I don't care. You're not going to win this fight. Okay, so if Jacob is wrestling with God, how do we interpret verse 25? If he's not going to win the fight, how do we understand verse 25? When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of his hip. How do we understand that? Here's how I understand that. When I was a kid, some of my greatest memories, my fondest memories of my father was him wrestling with me. My dad, he was an electrician and a welder. He would work hard all day long. He would come home, he would get in the shower, he'd eat some dinner, and if he wasn't too tired, I would coax him out of his recliner. We would push the coffee table to the wall. He would get on his knees, and he and I would fight. We'd wrestle right there in the middle of the living room floor. I mean, I loved these moments, but here's the thing. As I was getting older and getting bigger, I was getting stronger. And I wanted to test my strength. And the best way to test my new strength was to test it against the strongest man in my world. And so what that meant was I would fight with my dad, but that took on a whole new meaning for me. There was a significance attached to our wrestling matches that was not there for my dad, because to me, if I could somehow win, like for whatever reason, if I could be the one that finally pinned my dad, if I could put a move on my dad, put my dad into some sort of hold, if I could finally get my dad to cry uncle, then I would win, and in winning, it would open the doors to the hallowed halls of manhood. And I would become a man at that moment. So you could tell, like, man, a lot was riding on these wrestling matches for me. It meant a lot to me. And so I would wrestle with my dad, and I would fight with my dad. And here's the problem. All those times of I wrestling with my dad, I never once, ever beat him. Not once. But here's the problem. I wouldn't give up. Because so much was riding on these wrestling matches, I just refused, stubbornly refused to surrender. I needed to win. And so as we would wrestle and we would fight, my dad would pin me, my dad would put a hold on me, my dad would pick me up and send me sailing through the living room. I would get up and dust off, and I just kept attacking. I just kept coming. I just kept fighting. Even though I wasn't going to win, even though I had clearly been defeated, I refused to give up. Now, the crazy part is this. My mom would be over in the corner, sitting in her chair, reading a book. And in the way that only a mother can, she is there reading her book, surrounded by the violence and the chaos of two guys wrestling around in the middle of the living room floor. And she's completely oblivious to it. But my mom, being a mom, she has that mom sense. She can tell what's going on without even looking up. And my mom could sense the mood in the room begin to change as I would get more and more frustrated and more angry because I was not going to win yet again, but I wouldn't give up. And she could sense the tension in the room, and she would just say into the pages of her book, somebody's going to end up crying. Somebody's going to end up crying. I'll give you one guess who that was. It was never my dad. There was never a moment in all those wrestling matches where my dad ever jumped up off the living room floor, looked at me and said, that hurt. Ran into his room and sobbed into his pillow. No, that was me. And why is that? Because here's what would happen. Eventually, my dad would get tired of just me not giving up, just me being stubborn. And he had to motivate me to surrender. How did he motivate me? He put just enough hurt on me to take the fight out of me. And my mom knew what was coming. She could sense what was happening. She knew somebody's going to end up crying, and that was going to be me. But he had to put just enough hurt on me to take the fight out of me. I think that's what's going on here. When it says, when the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip. What was happening is that Jacob wasn't going to win the fight. The problem is Jacob wouldn't give up the fight. He would not surrender. And that's what we do. When we want God, but we want God on our terms. We want God in our own way. We want God to promote our agenda. And so we fight with God and wrestle with God. We refuse to surrender with God. But what happens eventually is when we keep fighting and resisting and rebelling and refusing, God has to intervene. And sometimes when God intervenes, it does not feel good. Students, I don't know who told you the lie that every time God shows up, it feels good. Sometimes God shows up and it does not feel good. And ask Jacob, he knows, because it says here, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip. Now, that word is a little bit deceptive, because here's what it sounds like, okay? It sounds like Jacob gets up and he's like coming after God again, and God's like, oh, boop. And like God just touches his hip. Like God pulls out the supernatural, miraculous wild card, and God just goes, boop. And he touches his hip. No. That word touch is a little bit, it's not a great translation. The word touch means to physically wrench or pull. It talks about strength and force. And so the image is not God going, boop. The image is more accurate to say God is grabbing ankles and he's going, make a wish. And God separates the hip. And I know some of you are like, well, time out. That's not real godly. Why would God do that? Why would God hurt his own creation? Guys, listen to something very, very clear, okay? Let me say something to you. Sometimes God, he will hurt you a little to keep you from hurting yourself a lot. Do you understand me? God will sometimes, he'll work to get your attention. And God will hurt you a little in order to keep you from hurting yourself a lot. And you know what? A dislocated hip is nothing compared to the path that Jacob was on until that moment. Where he was going without God in his life, it was worse than the hip. And so God separates the hip. And he's hurting. He breaks him. And guys, let me tell you something. I think there's more of us in this room. That's what we need. I think sometimes we come to camp, and I'm glad what we did here with kind of the broken down set. I love that. You know why? Because I think sometimes we come to camp, and we're so into the hype of camp. And we're so into the lights and the sounds and the music and everything that goes on with camp. And I think sometimes we come back and we're just sitting there and we're like, okay, impress me. Just impress me. Maybe I'll give you my attention if you impress me enough. Listen, students, I don't think we need to impress each other anymore. I think what we need is not for God to come in and blow us away with another grand and beautiful vision. I think, man, we've seen that, we've done that. What we need is God to meet us in a very real way, and sometimes that's a very painful way. We need God to break us, and some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. You have been fighting and wrestling. You have been rejecting and resisting God in your life. In your own way, you have been struggling against what you know God wants from you. You're wrestling right now. And I'm here to tell you, guys, you need to give up before God gets real, and it's going to hurt a little bit. But I think that's the best thing for us. And so he pops the hip. He separates the hip. And you think, well, that's it. That's that, right? Nope. Verse 26. We have to read this very carefully, because if it doesn't, it confuses us. Look at verse 26. Then the man said, let go of me, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let go of you unless you bless me. Now, how do we read that? Now, on the surface, it sounds like somehow Jacob, who, number one, he wasn't going to win the fight in the first place. And number two, now his hip is dislocated, his leg is useless, but somehow Jacob, even in his injury and even in his weakness, he has gained the upper hand, and he has God pinned to the desert floor, and God is looking up at Jacob going, you need to let go of me. It's almost daybreak. And Jacob says, nope, I'm not going to let go of you unless you bless me. It's like Jacob's in control here. No, that's not it at all. I don't think that's a picture at all. Here's how I see this. Sometimes, going back to my dad and me, when we would wrestle on the living room floor, sometimes what I would do is I would do what my dad called, I would play possum. Okay, I would lay there on the floor and go, I give up, I'm done, I give up, I surrender, I don't want to fight anymore, I'm done. And I would just pretend to give up. I would just act like I had given up. And then my dad, he would get up off the living room floor, and as he walked past me, I would spring into action. I would launch myself onto my dad's leg, right? I would sit on his foot, and I'd wrap myself around his calf, and I'd force him to walk with me through the house. Maybe I could trip him up, he could fall and knock himself unconscious, and I could declare victory, right? I think that's a better picture of what's happening here. I think when God says, let go of me, he's not looking up at Jacob. He's looking down at Jacob. And he's like, you really need to let go of my leg. And Jacob says, listen to this. No. I will not let go of you unless you bless me. Now, think about this for a moment. Jacob is coming to the end of himself. And guys, let me tell you something. This is a wonderful place. This is the best place you could ever get. He has come to the end of himself. There is nothing he can do. There is nothing he can provide. There's no money he can spend. There's no one in his life he can call. He is at the end of his rope. Literally, he is at the bottom. And he looks up at God. He says, no, I will not let you go. I cannot let you go. You see, because all my people are gone, and all my possessions are gone. Everyone I know and everything I own, it's all gone. And my brother who I haven't seen in 20 years, he's coming to meet me with 400 of his closest friends. So no, I will not let you go, because I cannot let you go, because you are all I have left. Have you ever come to the end of yourself and you realize, listen, you don't need more of anything. You don't need more success. You don't need more popularity. You don't need more grades. You don't need to win the election. You don't need to make the team. You don't need to get the scholarship. Really, I mean, those are things that have been distracting you and pulling your attention away. What do you really need? I mean, not what do you want. What do you need? And what you need is not more of what the world provides, because that's all a distraction. It numbs us to what our real need is. And when we come to the end of it, we become unraveled. God dismantles our life until we realize at the very bottom of our life, we look up, we're like, all I need is you. That's the only thing I really need. There's a lot of things in this world that I want, but you guys have begun to learn how to discern what you want from what you need. And you've just confused that. You've confused all the things that you want, and you think that you need them. You don't need them. What you need is God to come into your life and do something amazing. That's what you need. But you've confused want from need. Jacob's not confused anymore. He's got nothing left. So he wraps himself around God in absolute and utter desperation. And he says, I will not let you go, and I cannot let you go because you are all I have left. You're my only hope. And so he clings to God even tighter. And then there's this conversation. Verse 27, the man says, what is your name? What? No, we know who this is. We know this is God, and we know God knows Jacob. You know why? Because God, 20 years before, showed up in his life and said, I'm going to use you. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to prosper you. I'm going to do great things for you, right? God has not forgotten him. God made him. God numbered the hairs on Jacob's head. Do you think God, 20 years later, looks down at Jacob, clinging to his leg, and he just goes, oh, man, your face is so familiar. I can't remember, though. What's your name? You think God actually forgot Jacob's name? No. So why does he ask the question? He asks the question, listen to me very carefully, because if you miss this, you miss everything. He asks the question because in the Old Testament, in a way that we have a hard time understanding, in the Old Testament, a name was not just your identification, it was your very identity. A lot of times a parent in the Old Testament would name their child as a prophecy of what they would be or in the hopes of what they would become. And so a name was not just how you were known to other people, it was who you really were from the inside. It was your identity, it was your core, it was your values, it was your decisions, it was your will, it was everything, it was your emotion, it was who you were, it was your name. And so when God says, what is your name? Listen, he's not asking for Jacob's identification, he's asking for Jacob's confession. And when he says, what is your name? What he's really saying is, who are you? Not who do you pretend to be, not who do you hope to be, not who do you project yourself to be, not who do you imagine yourself one day to be, but who are you really? What is your name? And Jacob looks up at God and he says, and guys, for the first time in his story, he speaks his own name. Every other time he is asked in his story what his name is, he lies. This is the first time he tells the truth. When someone says, what is your name? He looks up at God and he says, my name is Jacob. What does Jacob mean? What is his identity? Jacob literally meant heel grabber. But metaphorically, symbolically, figuratively, it meant liar, swindler, thief, deceiver. And here's what's interesting. You go back and you look at his history. You know why and how he became successful? You know why and how he got all of his money? How he became so prosperous? It's because Jacob was Jacob. He was always looking to use the loopholes and work the angles and work things so they benefited only him. He was Jacob. And when God looks down and says, what is your name? He says, who are you really? And when he says, my name is Jacob, he is admitting to it. He's saying, I am Jacob. I am the heel grabber. I am the liar. Yes, I am the swindler. I am the thief. I am the deceiver. I admit it. I own it. I confess it. I am Jacob. Are you satisfied? Are you happy? That's me. I'm not proud of it, but it's who I am and it's what I do. I am Jacob. And God looks down at Jacob and he says, no. He says, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. Guys, do not miss this. What happens in this moment is that God gives Jacob a new name. And listen to me, it is not a nickname. It's not just a fun pet name. It's a new name. And every time in the Bible, when someone gets a new name, it is symbolic of a new identity. They become a new person. They become a new man. They become a new woman. They are changed. They are transformed. That's what salvation does. Salvation does not change your behavior. It changes your identity. It doesn't change what you do. Salvation changes who you are. And how does that happen? It happens when you come to realize your need. Just like Jacob, when you realize all I need is God in my life. That's the only thing I really need. There's a lot of things that I want, but the only thing I need is I need a relationship with God. And I need to stop wrestling. I need to stop struggling. I need to surrender because I need God in my life. When you recognize your need, and then just like Jacob, you confess your sin. When you say, I am Jacob. That's who I am. That's the life that I've lived. That's the decisions that I've made. That's what I've done. I am Jacob. That's when God can look down at you and he can pick you up and he can dust you off and he can look you in the eye and he can say, no, my child. No, son. No, daughter. Let me give you the name I chose for you. Let me give you the identity I picked for you. Let me turn you into the young man. Let me transform you into the young woman. You always knew you could be, but I made you to be. Let me give you your new name. Guys, if you look through all the great stories, all the great fairy tales, there is one common thread that runs through every single one of them. It's the thread of transformation. It's the story of redemption. All the great stories. Pinocchio longs to be a real boy. And it's the love of the Creator that transforms him and gives him a new identity. Cinderella is lifted from the ashes, from the cinders, by the love of the prince. The grotesqueness of the beast is transformed by the love of the beauty. It's always about transformation. And you know why we love those stories so much? Because there's something in all of those stories that resonates deeply within all of us because we all know we need transformation. We all know we need redemption. We need someone greater and more beautiful outside of us to come in and say, I love you, I value you, and I want to make you into who you always were meant to be. I want to give you a new name. I want to make you a new person. So God became man to turn creatures into sons. Listen, not simply to produce better men of the old kind, but to produce a new kind of man. C.S. Lewis said that. If you think Christianity is all about changing your behavior, then you don't understand the gospel. The gospel doesn't just change your behavior, it changes you. It transforms you. It makes you the young man or the young woman that God intended for you to be. How does it happen? We just saw it there. We recognize our need, we confess our sin, and God comes in and says, here's who you are. Here's my question to you as we wrap up tonight. What is your name? I want you to sit with that for a moment. Just for a moment. What is your name? Right here, right now. Don't run from it. Don't deflect it. Just ask that question. What's my name? Some of you don't like the answer to that question right now. You don't like the things you're doing. You don't like the person you're becoming. You don't like the path you're on, but you don't know a way out. You don't know how to change. You know what? That's okay. You can't change. You are powerless to change. But God Like all the great stories, he can come and change us. He can come and transform us. He can turn you into that person, redeeming you, transforming you, lifting you up out of the ash, turning you into a real boy or girl, right? Giving you a new life. What is your name? When you confess your need and your sin, God comes in and can change your name. And I want to give you an opportunity to have that now. So what I want to do now, we're going to do this just like we did last night. So there's no surprises. I'm going to invite you at this moment. Would you just bow your heads with me? Bow your heads, close your eyes. We're going to have a moment of just reflection, a moment of response. And if you tonight, if it just became real to you, if suddenly what has for a long time been fuzzy, been blurry, suddenly it became so clear to you. You understand it now like you've never understood it before. God spoke to you, God showed you some things, and you realize, man, what you need is him. You're getting some real clarity between what you want and what you need, and you see you need him. And you're tired of fighting, you're tired of struggling, you're tired of wrestling, you're tired of resisting, you're tired of rejecting. You're just tired, and so it's time to surrender. It's time to give up. And so I want to encourage you to do that. And I want to lead you in a prayer just to signify that moment of where you're surrender to him in your life, where you give your life to him. You allow Jesus to come in and transform you. The resurrection power of Jesus comes into our life and raises us from the dead. His death paid for our sin. His resurrection brings us new life, and we put our hope in that in this moment. If that's you, would you do that with me? Just say it. Just in your heart, I want you to repeat these words with me. Father, tonight, I give up. Father, tonight, I finally, and for the first time, I surrender. I trust you. I put my faith in the fact that you died for me. I put my faith in the reality of your resurrection. And I turn the control of my life over to you because I know you love me and you want the best for me. So I give myself to you the best way I know how. The only way I can. I give myself to you right now, surrendering my life. Just like we did last night, I'm going to ask you if you prayed that with me, if you just lifted those words up in this moment. I want to know who you are. I want to know who I'm talking to. So just like we did last night, would you look at me? Wherever you are in this room, would you just take a look up, make sure I can see you? Want to know who I'm talking to? Want to know who prayed that with me? Maybe it's something you did last night. You just didn't have the opportunity to come forward. Maybe it's something you did on the rec field. Maybe it's something you did in between the cabin and the cafeteria. Maybe it's something you did in your church group time, but at some point, you have given your life to Jesus. You have confessed your need. You have given him your sin. Would you look at me? Now, those of you that are looking at me right now, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Just like we did last night, so there's no surprises. You know exactly what's coming. I want to invite you in just a moment to come stand with me, but let me remind you why. 2 reasons. Number one, you're not the same. You have been transformed. You have a new life, a new identity. You gave your life to Jesus. He took it. He's given you a new life. And for a long time, you're gonna come to terms with that reality. It's an amazing thing. And so you can tell people as you stand and come forward, you can tell everyone what God has just done in your heart. You can tell everyone what God has just done in your life. Second reason is this. I can connect you tonight with someone who made a very similar decision, who prayed a very similar prayer not long ago, and they have walked the road just a little bit further than you have, but they can answer your questions, and they can know how to encourage you, and they could be praying for you and helping you understand what does it mean to be a Christian, how to live this Christian life. And so I can pull you out and connect you with those people that can begin to help you do that very thing, because this is the beginning of your life, and you need someone to show you how to live it. So I want you to come forward so I can connect you with someone that can do that starting now, in this very moment. So wherever you are in this room, if you're looking at me right now, just like we did last night, and you understand what I'm asking you to do, and you understand why I'm asking you to do it, I invite you to stand now and come on up to the front and meet here with me. Come on up, guys. Adults, counselors, youth ministers, I'm going to invite you. If you see your student coming forward, you can go ahead and come up and stand with them. Come on up, stand beside them, stand next to them. I want to get you closer to them than we did last night. Make sure they stand here with someone. It's great. This is awesome. All right, as you guys continue to make your way here, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pray for you. And I'm going to pray over you. And then as soon as I say amen, whichever one you're closest to, you can go to either side. There are rooms set up, and you guys can sit and just talk for a little bit and take those next steps, all right? Father, thank you for this moment. Thank you for these students that are willing to stand and be counted, to be seen, and for them to make this declaration about what you have just done in their hearts, what you've just done in their lives. Thank you, God, for this opportunity to see these students in their boldness and in their courage. God, bring people to stand with them. Bring godly men and women to walk with them. Bring other students, other teenagers who are working just to run hard after you, even in their teenage years, to be an example to them and to encourage them. God, surround them and give them a boldness to share their story, protect them from discouragement. God, just use them. Glorify your name to the ends of the earth. We pray this in Jesus' name.